Hello and welcome back to SAP on Microsoft Azure. My name is Mark, and today we're going to continue the journey of building a cluster on Azure for SAP apps. I'm recording this session from Seattle, from Redmond this week, so it's going to be probably a bit shorter than the recent sessions. I'm not having enough time, but let's see how far we get. Before we start, let's have a quick look on what we've done the last time. We're going to do a quick recap. The next step in the cluster configuration is to set up a witness, and we're also going to cover what a quorum is in a cluster. We're going to install the SQL Server on both of the nodes. So please note this is not a cluster installation or a SQL Server installation into the cluster. We're going to install it individually on both nodes because the fourth point, we want to do AlwaysOn, which is probably a very common scenario for SAP workload. So let's get started. So last time we prepared Azure by setting up all the necessary networks and storage and compute components. We had to set up an Active Directory, which was not part of the video. But again, there's plenty of good videos on YouTube and other documentations on the web available. We prepared two E4 nodes. E4 is Azure's E-Series, which is probably one of the most suitable compute SKUs for SAP workload. It has a core to memory ratio of 1:8, which means one core, 8 GB of memory, which is really good for SAP workload because usually you run out of memory before you run out of compute. Then we installed the cluster feature of Windows 2016 on these two nodes, and once we did that, we formed a new cluster for the SAP database called clustSAPDB01.corp.contoso.com. Now, just to get that back into our memory, we have a subnet called default where we have our jump station, which is here. We have a management subnet where we have the two domain controllers. We have two subnets for the database cluster, a private one and a public one, to which we installed the two DB nodes, the cluster nodes, SAP DB node 1 and 2. And in the last video, we've set up the first cluster resource, which we've called cluster SAP DB01 on IP address 10.0.4.50. All these are obviously private IP addresses for the virtual machines and not public endpoints. And we have two more subnets, the app subnet for the application service, which we're going to look at a later video, and the web subnet, which we may choose to use or not at a later point in time. Now, in the beginning of this video, we briefly touch base on the terminology cluster quorum. Quorums in clusters are there to prevent the split brain syndrome, which basically means that in case, for example, if the communication between the two cluster nodes is being cut off, for example, the line fails for whatever reason, both nodes will stay active and individually serve client requests. In a transactional system, that's obviously disastrous, so that's a situation we need to avoid. So in our case, if we look at a two-node cluster, which would be here, we require a witness, which is in our case simply the quorum, which we need to set up. That basically will decide in case, for example, then the communication between the nodes fails. It will decide which node will continue transacting and which node will be forcefully shut down. Now, in the past, we were using as a cluster quorum or witness, we were usually using a file share in order to store the quorum information. Now with Azure we have the option of a cloud quorum, which is really great. I've listed some of the benefits here, so if you can use a cloud quorum, you should usually go for it. It's not only a lot cheaper, but it's also a lot easier to handle. It requires less operational overhead and so forth. So again, particularly if you are in Azure, it's a no-brainer to use a cloud witness. So we're basically picking it up from where we left it the last time. I've logged on to the first cluster node, which is SAP DB node 01, and I've started the failover cluster manager. And you can see we still have both nodes. They're both up. They both have assigned a vote, and currently only the second node has a vote. So we're now going to create the cloud witness by right-clicking the cluster resource. We go to More Actions, and we select Configure Cluster Quorum Settings. The Configure Cluster Quorum wizard starts. We're going to click Next on the information page. We want to use the advanced quorum configuration. We click Next here, and then it basically asks us whether we want to include all the nodes in the selection in terms of voting, which we want. So we click Next here. We'll go on this page, we go on the third option because we want to configure a cloud witness and not a disk or file share witness. So we're just going to click Next here. And then it asks us two items. The one is the storage account name, and the second is the storage account key. And we get this information obviously from our portal. So let's have a look there. So we're just gonna have a quick look at the Azure portal on the storage account that I'm using for the SAP Sandbox system. So we'll just sort this, and we're gonna have a look at the storage account, which is called SAP Sandbox Diag 555, and there's just some overview information loading on the content, but what's interesting for us is the access keys as well as the storage account name, which we're gonna need when we're gonna create the cloud witness on the virtual machine. So I've now copied all the relevant data from the Azure portal into the cloud witness configuration wizard, and we now can basically configure the cloud witness. So all there was is pretty much the storage account as well as the account key. So we're going to click Next here. And this is just the confirmation or an overview on what we're going to do. So we're going to click Next here as well. And that was quick. We have the summary. The cloud witness have been configured. And what you can see here now in the cluster core resources, we have a new resource which is called Cloud Witness. So it all seemed to have worked out great. And we're now gonna have a quick look at the storage account with Storage Explorer, where we can actually see the Quorum file. So we're now back on the jump box, which I've used to access Azure. We're now looking at Storage Explorer, which is a tool that you can download from the Microsoft website. It's available for macOS, Linux, and Windows. And it's basically a GUI to manage storage. And what I've done so far is I've attached my storage account using the name and the key, and in theory it should pop up under storage accounts on the left hand side in the menu, which it does. Fantastic. So if we open that, the SAP Sandbox Diag 555, we're going to see 4 components, what we would see under every storage account in Azure, which is blob, file, queues, and tables. We're going to look into blobs, and we would expect to see all our disks that we've created so far. And what we also see is the Microsoft Cloud Witness, which is fantastic. So that all seemed to have worked, and we can continue on the journey of creating this SAP cluster. Okay, now with the Cloud Witness up and running, it looks like we have a fully functional cluster. We now have for both the nodes a vote each, as well as for the witness, which means we have an uneven amount of votes, so we're all good here. Now, one thing I have not done so far, which is something you probably would want to do, particularly when you're intending to run the cluster in production with SAP workload, which is the validation. Now again, this is just a sandbox, so we don't really care, but nevertheless I want to run the validation, the cluster validation for you, just so you can have a look on what it does. It's basically just a test in order to make sure we've covered all the various aspects, and I suggest we just let it run and see what happens. It asks me here whether it wants to run all tests or just a subset of tests. We're gonna choose all tests. And it starts collecting all the necessary information, and it will run. I will just wait for it to finish. It may take some time, and it may come up with some warnings. And we'll just have a look whether the warnings are of any concern in terms of what we want to do, or whether we can just ignore them. Checking the network configuration always takes a bit, but I think that's pretty much the last step. And in a few seconds we should be good. Awesome, it seems to have finished, so we'll just wait for the report to come up, and here it is. It told me there's some warnings. These are the nodes it tested, so that's all good. We only have two, so let's scroll down until we see something yellow or red. Nothing, that's awesome. So summary, there's one warning which is it's the timeout, the quorum arbitration, so that's nothing serious. At this case, we'll skip that again. This is just a sandbox in a real cluster. Please do not ignore it, and check whether this is whether any of the warnings that pop up here are of your concern. All right, so I think it's about time to set up the SQL Server. Now, when we look at setting up SQL Server as AlwaysOn, we have to do two distinct installations of SQL Server, two instances on each of the nodes. And then we're going to include them into the Microsoft failover cluster that we've just finished configuring and installing. Again, as mentioned earlier in the video, if you set up this type of components in your Azure cloud environment or locally in an on-premise setup, please always make sure that you have the latest documentation and information from Microsoft and SAP at hand. These videos are not a replacement for the documentation, it's just a demonstration. So let's get that started. So I've downloaded the standard installation media of SQL Server 2012 from SAP. 2012 because this is what comes with the specific NetWeaver installation. We could have used a later version, but for this demo it's enough. So we're just going to go through a standard SQL Server installation for SAP. We're going to start the setup. The first tab in the installation center just gives us an overview on all the various documentation and planning hints which are available. We're going to go straight to installation, and we're going to choose the first option, use SQL Server standalone installation. Please note, again, not the second option, which is the failover cluster installation. So setups checks whether there are some issues with the current nodes, which are not, which is great. So we're just gonna say okay here, and we're gonna continue in the installation. Also, setup will check whether there are product updates. This installation media of SQL Server seems to be on the latest version, so we're just gonna click next here. It's gonna be some further checks done.
There's one warning around Windows Firewall. I haven't disabled it yet. I've just set the corresponding firewall rules, which we require later. So we just ignore this at this point. Again, this is a sandbox. If you do set up a production cluster for SAP workload, please make sure if there's a warning, it's not an issue for you. The standard media from SAP comes with a product key, which we're going to use here. So we just click Next. These are the terms and conditions. We accept the license terms, so we continue. And then we want to do a SQL Server feature installation because we want to choose the feature that SAP later requires. Again, all this information is in the NetWeaver documentation. How to install SQL Server from the SAP Marketplace, from the Support Center. Please use the version that is relevant for what you want to do. So basically, I'm just reading down what SAP tells me that is required. So we'll need the database engine. We will need full text and semantic extraction. We will need client tools connectivity, which is further down. We will need client tools backward compatibility. We need the SDK. We need the management tools. Also the documentation components. And the SQL client connectivity SDK. I'm okay with the installation directories. Again, if you do a production installation, and you have different standards, please make sure that you follow them and install them in the corresponding directory. Again, some checks, no warnings, no issues, we continue. Here we're going to be asked whether we're going to do a default instance or named instance. In this case, I'm going to choose a a named instance. And everything else should be good. This is just disk space requirement. We have enough disk space available, so we click Next. These are the various SQL Server services and under which account they run, as well as their startup type, which could be manual or automatic. This is fine for now. We're going to click Next. This is about the authentication mode, Windows authentication mode for ABAP. If you've got a dual stack, which these days will be rather rare, you're going to go with mixed mode, or Java requires mixed mode. So we're going to go with Windows authentication mode, and we're going to add the current user as the SQL Server administrator. I was actually just checking, I missed the collation that is required, which is very important. So as you know, SQL Server runs on collations. So we want to make sure that we choose the right one, which is SQL 18.1 General 8 CP 850 bin 2. So we need to fix that. SQL 18.1 General CP 850 bin 2 according to the SAP documentation. So we're good here. All this has been done. And we can continue here. This is just around error reporting. We'll leave that as is. 4 more checks, no warnings, no issues. We're gonna continue. And this is the installation summary ready to install. We review whether everything has been set up the way it's supposed to be, which looks good. And once we reviewed everything and are happy to install, we just click the install button, which then basically triggers the installation. I'm probably not gonna wait until that's finished because I would expect that's gonna take a couple of minutes. So we'll just wait for it to finish. And I'm gonna continue the video once the installation routine has been finalized. So the installation has been finished, and it looks like all components have been installed successfully. So that's good. So we're just closing the setup, and we're gonna have a look at the SQL Server console. So we should now have in the menu a folder for SQL Server 2012. Yeah, it's here, which is good. So we're gonna look down into the Management Studio for SQL Server. That's the first step we do. We're gonna connect to the selected database. We're gonna do a quick check whether everything looks good. So we've got master, model, MSDB and tempDB, so that looks all good. And then we're configuring the instance for AlwaysOn, where we need the SQL Server configuration manager. That basically gives us an overview on the various areas of configuration for SQL. And what we need is the SQL Server service itself. We're going to right click into properties, and what we're going to see is that there's a tab for AlwaysOn high availability. That's what I meant earlier. This is basically where we hook up the standalone SQL Server instance with the cluster that we've installed in the previous videos. And it already found the name, which is really good. And then we're just set enable AlwaysOn availability groups, and we say okay. And that's all. All that needs to happen now is basically to restart the service to take the changes into effect, which we're briefly gonna do here. And if we check properties again, we see it's active. So the steps we've just done, as in installing SQL Server and integrating it into AlwaysOn, into the cluster, is exactly what we're going to do for the second node. I'm probably not going to include this into this video, but I think you get the idea. So much for this overview. You can find more technical enablement videos on this YouTube channel. And if you want to get notified for new videos released, please subscribe. Also, please do not hesitate to leave your comments on this video. And if you like, please give us your vote. Thanks for watching.